Be quiet. Okay.
All right. Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, February 17th, 2021, 5:01 p.m. And I don't know what to do with myself anymore because there is no impeachment trial. There's no Donald Trump Twitter feed. And Mitch McConnell is not giving speeches explaining the opposite of the way he voted. And so I feel like I have this abundance of spare time. I'm going to use it to do handcrafts, to read Dostoevsky in Russian, and of course Homer in ancient Greek, which will require learning ancient Greek and relearning Russian. But in the meantime, we're not allowed to have fun anymore.
Hence the Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment is a page turner. In lieu of fun, we are allowed to have the former FBI Director Jim Comey, who has a new book, Saving Justice, and who is going into the product placement business with Lawfare merch. Reminder that you too can get your Lawfare merch at thelawfarestore.com. Jim, welcome to In Lieu of Fun, the lowest budget show, and by low budget I mean zero budget, you have ever appeared on.
It's good to be with you. And so I'm gathering the product placement is unreimbursed.
It is unreimbursed. Yeah, it's
I'm still waiting on reimbursement for the last 327 days.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us about the book. You've it is a book that is part memoir, part set of reflections on the nature of Justice Department values, part in a subtle way, part polemic. What was the concept as you were sitting down to work on it?
Yeah, I was not going to write a second book about the government, but the more I watched...
Oh, but that sounds so fun. Sorry.
Yeah. In lieu of that, I was not going to do that. But I decided after watching Trump and his enablers, particularly Bill Barr, take a flamethrower to the institution of justice, that it might be useful to try and explain to non-experts why it matters so much, why this institution is so important, what it's supposed to be about, and why those of us who know it well are so worried about what we see going on. And I would try and do that in a way that would appeal to the non-expert audience, tell fun stories that I hoped would illuminate the values, show a little bit about the way in which they have been run down, damaged, and offer a vision, an optimistic vision about the future of the institution. That was my goal. I mean, I hope law students will read it. I hope people who might want to be feds will read it. But more than that, I hope people who are non-experts who want to understand why so many of us are so passionate about these institutions, why we feel that way.
And as I read through it, one of my big takeaway is that the overriding value that binds all these chapters together is earnestness. That, it's the difference between letting a little inadvertent slip pass. You didn't know the FBI agent, for perfectly legit reasons, borrowed some cash from the evidence box to save an old woman from getting offed. And the jury didn't know either. It actually has no bearing on the case, but you tell the judge anyway, and you tell the defense anyway, and you risk a valid case over it because it's the right thing to do. And there's a whole series of these incidents where they're kind of margin calls whether they're necessary, and the sort of overall argument of the book is they're necessary because if you don't, it leads to Bill Barr, which you don't ever say quite that bluntly, but But that's kind of the implication, that once you let go of them a little bit, there's nothing that prevents you from letting go of them a lot. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. That the truth is a real thing, that it has to be at the center of this institution. And one of the ways you keep it at the center is remember who you represent. You're not representing your boss or the agent who might be embarrassed or Donald Trump. You're representing this idea. And if this idea is going to work, if there's going to be justice, people have to trust it. And they can't trust it if you don't tell the truth about everything. So that's the idea. And look, spoiler alert, you don't have to read the book, just look at the cover. That the trust of the American people is the lifeblood of that institution. And you only get it by telling the truth and showing them that truth, whether it's good or bad about the work you've done.
So this is super interesting. I do a lot of work on right now currently, like big tech. And so I follow them around and I write about kind of what it is that they're doing in various places. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the ways in which the courts are not transparent. All of the ways in which non-transparency, at least in courts, actually increases their legitimacy. Like when you like, if you don't see how the sausage gets made, it's like a lot easier to eat the sausage. And like, it's just kind of this type of thing where you have, when you have all of this kind of perfect transparency, you also don't have the full like range of being able to experiment with ideas or express all of the ideas that you might want to say. So I'm thinking of like a Second Circuit panel. Then when I was clerking, my judge wouldn't tell us what happened in like the deliberations. Like he'd come out and be like, well, this is kind of where we're going. This is the broad overview, but I didn't have like perfect transparency into that. No one did. And that there was some value to that. So like, how do you kind of thread that needle here?
Well, you can't have perfect transparency and run any kind of institution, especially one that deals with people's rights through criminal prosecution or national security secrets. And so what I think of as an expression that used to have at a place I worked, which is you don't have to say everything that's on your mind, but if it's on your lips, it better be what's on your mind. That is, when you speak, it better be the truth and it better be complete. But you don't have to say everything and share everything, because that actually inhibits in some ways getting to truth, if people are afraid to ask dumb questions or make arguments that they ultimately drop when they write the opinion. So I don't think of it as hyper transparency.
But one of the things that I've been very struck by, and this also concerned me as I was reading the book, is, I look at, and you talk about this in one of the latter chapters, that, you do complex investigations, there are going to be mistakes. The IG is going to look back, find things that were done wrong or should have been done differently, or in some cases that he would have liked to have seen done differently, which he's not always so great at distinguishing between these categories. Despite an intense amount of investigation, despite the investigation itself having been done in a pretty transparent fashion, at least once it was revealed to exist, despite courts having looked at it, et cetera, a huge number of people around the country don't buy any of it. They believe that you're the chief conspirator, that you were feeding dog treats to Pete Strzok under the table, that I was your kind of chief information officer leaking everything. And all of this is completely untethered to any kind of reality, and no amount of organizational culture or discipline or the conduct of the investigation or the conduct of prosecutions. Huge number of people believe that, including the former Attorney General, believes that Michael Flynn was set up somehow, as though he were beaten into lying and then pleading guilty to it. And so my question is earnestness overrated? That, it assumes a certain amount of institutional culture that's capable of recognizing it, that's capable of taking the truth seriously, that's capable of understanding that there is a truth, and that, we may be talking about 55, 60, 70% of the population for whom that is even true. But there's an immense number of people for whom it is not true. And that group of people is capable of, invading the Capitol and then actually believing that they didn't do anything wrong because they thought they were following the instructions of the incumbent president. So I guess that's a really long-winded way of saying, is it possible that the meta value that you're talking about in this book is actually overrated in relative to, not overrated in the abstract, but overrated in practice in terms of the work that it can do to get people to believe in the department?
I guess it depends upon your baseline expectations for what earnestness can do. So in that sense, I suppose if you think that by telling the truth and being transparent about it, you're gonna get everybody to understand what is true and to care about it. I don't approach it that way. I have a pretty dark view of people, but I don't know what the alternative is to telling the truth and being earnest. Surrendering in the face of that kind of cynicism and lying strikes me as the worst of maybe of poor alternatives, but it's by far the poorest of the alternatives. So you tell the truth, and go ahead.
I'm not arguing for surrendering, but I would say if you and I had sat down 4 years ago and we had said, will the truth matter to the Bill Barrs of the world and the Rudy Giulianis of the world, and you treat Rudy Giuliani with a devastating soft touch in this book, but I think we would have said maybe not Rudy, who was already showing signs of, but certainly the Bill Barrs of the world. I would have said the Lindsey Grahams of the world. And I am disappointed not in the power of truth, but in the persuasive power of truth. With no suggestion that I have a good alternative to it, because I'm not going to, embrace lies in exchange. But I do think the truth should have done a hell of a lot more work than it did over the last few years, specifically in the justice arena.
Yeah, maybe. I don't have a control, so I don't know how bad it would be otherwise. But sure, I mean, to take the particular Barr, as I say in the book, I was wrong about Barr. That I underweighted two things. First, I missed the significance of his applying for the job by trashing Mueller's pursuit of obstruction. But second, I missed the significance of his institutional experience. I had thought, well, look, the guy comes from the Justice Department, and so surely he will abide the norms and the values of the institution. I missed the fact that he had only been in power positions at Justice. He had actually never investigated a case, never learned some of the things I try to teach in the book from things I went through. And so, but however I missed it, I definitely missed it.
It's okay.
Graham, I was not surprised by. He is a certain kind of person, and I don't think I missed that one.
Yeah, would you say you lowered the bar? Sorry.
Cheap, Kate. Go ahead.
I was actually going to ask you about this because I haven't gotten a chance to look at your book yet. I read the review that Joe Klein wrote, and I've read parts of it. You didn't read it? Oh, it's it's actually nice. It's good.
Yeah, I don't read reviews. I
don't read reviews either. Like, don't.
I don't want to fall in love with good reviews. I don't want to over-index on poor reviews. So.
I read all reviews of my book.
Wait, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Kind of obsessively in a fashion that reflects deep vanity, and I remember them.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I let people like you do that for me. I
do it for my friends, and I do it. I don't take reviews personally, but I do really remember them.
You had some nice blurbs on your most recent book.
Yeah, including one from you. I think we have the only. I think we're still the only book that both you and Hillary Clinton blurbed.
Yeah,
I
we did not coordinate that.
I did.
I wanted to ask really quickly though. I was kind of curious. I've always wondered this when you start out in like such a prestigious position as the U.S. Attorney in SDNY, but it is a position of power. And then before that, you practiced obviously, and there's everything that leads up to that, and it is a very different way of understanding the systems that you're running and the institutions. It's to kind of put it in tech language or programming language, it's like the term is dog fooding, like when you build something and you also use it, or you also eat it, like if you make the dog food, eat the dog food, like type of thing. So it's just kind of, I feel like there's a lot of people that are in leadership positions right now that have never done that, and I think that it has to be invaluable. And like, how did that build into your time as U.S. Attorney and as FBI Director?
Well, it helped that I had come up through the institution. I had learned sometimes in doing things well and sometimes in doing things not so well, what the institution was about, and about who my client was, that I did not represent a political leader or anyone else. I represented this idea of justice, and that, plus learning about the importance of showing the work, and that you don't get a sense of when you're a line prosecutor. You learn that, as I did, when you're a supervisor and communities are concerned about what the hell you're doing, and you realize it's not enough to do it well. We have to show it to people so they understand it. That coming up as an AUSA and then a supervisor and then U.S. Attorney, all of those things were drilled into me. So when I got to the top of the institution as Deputy AG or FBI Director, it was just sort of second nature. I assumed that's how you have to act to lead the institution.
I want to talk about, the title of the book is Saving Justice, which is, of course, a pun on the Department of Justice, and the imperative which you talk about in the last couple chapters of restoring confidence in it. I was thinking for a while of writing a book about Edward Levy, which I may still do at some point, and his very, very brief 18 months or so tenure as Attorney General, and how it changed the perceptions of and the reality of the Department of Justice. You make a point kind of in passing about this that I want to hear you flesh out. So, in the case of Ed Levy, the institution was completely rotten. And it was rotten not just at the top levels, at John Mitchell's level, but, at the staff level. They were doing all kinds of things that were just not okay, up and down throughout the investigative and prosecutorial institutions. And so a huge part of restoring the department was actually making it law compliant. Here, you argue, and I agree, that the basic institution is pretty healthy, and that there is a culture of compliance, which is why so few line attorneys were willing to be on briefs when Bill Barr wanted to do these things. And so you have a superstructure that is not behaving in a fashion accord with the values of the institution, but a substructure that actually takes those values really seriously. And yet you have a crisis of confidence in the institution. So now you're Merrick Garland and you're coming in, and you can't just issue the Levy guidelines, right? These really important reforms, because there actually isn't that much to reform. The institution is kind of okay. So, and giving speeches, yeah, that's important, but you're not going to restore confidence in the Justice Department by giving speeches. So what does a Merrick Garland do, who walks in having talked about Ed Levy, having, really wanting to restore the institution, other than just be an honest guy and kind of behave the way people behaved before the Trump administration? What does it actually consist of, restoring confidence in the department?
I think it has two pieces, one that's easier for the reasons that you said, and one that's harder. The easier piece is going to be just unlocking what's been hidden and bound up over the last 4 years inside the department, letting people act what's written on their hearts already about consistent with the values of the institution. But a key part of that will be attracting great people and picking great people who are in the Levy model and in the Merrick Garland model to be the U.S. attorneys around the country in the 94 districts, 93 U.S. attorneys overseeing 94 districts, because those are the people who are going to be seen by Americans more often than they'll see the attorney general. So that's internal. Unlock, make sure people are free to act the way the culture wants them to act, and pick great people to represent the culture. That gets to the second piece. The representation thing has to be the dominant focus of his tenure as AG and that of the U.S. attorneys, because there are millions of Americans who've internalized lies about the department. And the only way you help people out of that fog of lies is show them something different. And so I think there's going to be a premium. Speech making makes it sound like it's sort of a rote thing. He's got to get out there and represent the work of the department to the American people and charge the 93 U.S. attorneys to get out there and show people the work the way we really are. So and that's how you'll gradually regain the confidence of the American people.
So what does that mean? Does it mean press conferences? Does it mean being super available to Congress for public testimony? Does it mean, I mean, you know, you went...
I would do all of that. He ought to be on Colbert. He ought to be on The View. I've done that. Maybe he doesn't want to be on The View, but the U.S. attorneys do as well. That they need to get out there and represent the institution, show people who you are and what you represent. And that's not about speeches to the American Bar Association. That's about doing what otherwise seems maybe a little undignified, but show yourself to the American people.
And
but yet, like, showing yourself to the American people is like so. I'm like having a moment about this right now, which is kind of like, don't you think that there's something like that's like you've been insulated from that? Like that is not something that like that you've traditionally had to do as like a U.S. attorney or an FBI director, is show yourself
or
to go on The View.
Judge.
To go on The View, or the judge to go on The View. Yes, exactly. And so like part of me is like, are we having unrealistic expectations for things? Maybe the press has always been filled with like some measure of like lies about like public officials and why they do the things that they do. And they weren't like called on to leave their official positions or the time that they devote to that to go and defend themselves all the time on the air on like cable news shows. Like part of me thinks that maybe it like kind of contributes to like this entire debate being like totally weren't unable to make heads or tails of it.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that it's great and essential to do the work well. But you want to communicate with the American people, and the American people aren't communicated with through speeches to the Bar Association or articles in the Yale Law Journal. They're communicated to in different ways than they were 50 years ago. And so, again, I'm not suggesting doing undignified things, right? You don't need to go on American Ninja Warrior or something if you're the Attorney General, but you need to get out there and show the work to the American people.
That's the deputy's job.
Exactly. Yeah. Lisa Monaco is ready.
So I think this is such an interesting and hard question because I think about how much mileage the Trumpist crazies got out of media availability, and how I really believe it works. But I also think there is a lot of the answers to a lot of questions are, as Janet Reno used to robotically say, I cannot comment on a pending investigation. But I think about Reno a lot because when I was a young cub reporter, she had a weekly press availability, and I don't think I realized that attorneys general before her didn't do that, and certainly attorneys general after her didn't do it. But every week, Thursday morning, the Justice Department press corps would come up to her conference room, and she would sit there at the table and take questions. And it was, And the answers to most of them were, I cannot comment on a pending investigation. And it drove everybody nuts. But it was great. And it was, and now it would be televised. It wasn't, I don't think it, I mean, there were networks there, but they would just film for clips. And I think about that, and I think, that's not Merrick Garland's personality to do that, although he was PAYDAG at the time. But it was great. And it was, it was just this understanding that every week you could ask the Attorney General a question. And, sometimes you'd very seldom get answers, but just the ability to do it was significant.
Yeah, I know, because I've been one of them, that justice leaders don't love the idea of doing a lot of press availabilities because you can't talk about cases. In ordinary times, it wouldn't be necessary. But now we're living in an environment where millions of Americans have been lied to about the institution you lead. And so you have to contribute to leading them out of that fog. And you do it by showing yourself. When I was FBI director, every time I visited a field office, I would do a press conference. Not because I wanted to run for office or talk about cases. I wanted to represent the FBI on the local news. So people would say, oh, I didn't realize that. They're focused on this or that. That's your job as someone whose institution depends upon public trust and confidence. It's all the more your job when you're in a time when public trust and confidence has been eroded by 4 years of lies.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to ask you about one matter that's sort of outside the scope of the book, but which is, has our counterterrorism imagination been unduly limited with respect to white supremacists, and sort of, we've prosecuted a lot of white nationalism cases, militia cases, and yet the movement does seem to have flourished over the last few years and grown, and certainly at this point seems a bigger homeland threat than the Islamist terrorist groups that we've spent an immense amount of time on. I think it was back in 2015 you observed in front of Congress that you had open ISIS investigations in all 50 states. And the message of that was, look, the lights are really blinking red on ISIS. Based on what you've seen now with respect to the white supremacist groups, how are the lights blinking on that as far as you're concerned?
I think that they're blinking much more brightly and more rapidly than any other threat in the homeland right now. You're talking about thousands of people who've been radicalized in the same way that the Islamic State sought to radicalize in 14 and 15 that was so concerning. And they have ready access to weapons, and they already live in our communities. And so it's a serious threat, one that I assume that the FBI is devoting the resources that it has and that are necessary. But I think that looking back at that ought to be part of whatever the Capitol Attack Commission is about. It ought to look at, were we thinking about this in the right way? And are there any impediments to investigation that we ought to talk about? I mean, is the First Amendment in some ways limiting investigations in a way that is not reasonable, or is it entirely reasonable? But those questions have to be asked.
Do you have, other than me, because I have on this show nominated myself to run this commission, do you have a favored category of person who, like, who's the Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton of this period, other than me, of course?
I would say you and someone like Chuck Rosenberg come to mind right away.
Would it be the Wittes-Rosenberg Commission or the Rosenberg-Wittes Commission? Or
maybe you could find some merging of the names. That would be clever.
Yeah.
The Rosen-Witt Commission.
I couldn't roll my eyes like hard enough in that question, Ben.
No, I'm gonna, from now on, I got Wayne Betts to endorse this idea yesterday. I've now got Comey. Eventually, it's just going to get critical mass, and Pelosi's going to call me.
So I muted myself. I think that one of the questions that I was going to ask was just kind of right now, are there ways that you think Do you just think that this, like, the country is in a mode of recovery from the last 4 years? Do you think that there should be like particular issues that the country should be kind of charging forward on that aren't necessarily like a response to the last 4 years? How are you kind of feeling about that with the Justice Department?
I think we're in a recovery mode, and I was attracted, although I had not thought of it before, to the framework that Bob Grenier offered in a Times op-ed 2 weeks ago, that we really ought to think about this through the lens of radicalization, that there are three missions. One is to incapacitate the violent, so to find and lock up those who assaulted the Capitol or conspiring to engage in acts of violence, essential. Second, try to help lead the population away from the message of radicalization. And then closely related is the third piece, which is try to push the radicalizer to the corner, the radicalizer being Donald Trump in the main. And so I think the next 3-4 years are going to be consumed by that, whether you are at justice or another part of the government, because the credibility of the United States government depends upon people not being defrauded into thinking it's illegitimate in some way. And so justice has to focus on that. Everything you do as Attorney General or U.S. Attorney has to be done with that goal in mind, helping to lead people out of the fog and restore more. Again, you don't do it perfectly. It's all about margins, but gain more and more marginal support for the credibility of the institution.
All right. Before we go to normal audience questions, Kathleen Ballou of the University of Chicago has, I just saw her in the chat. Kathleen is the author of a truly fabulous book about the history of modern white nationalist movements and white power violent movements. So I thought I would invite her on and see if she had any questions in that regard.
I do have a question. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be invited at the last second to talk to you. Hi. I think my question is actually the same as one of the audience questions around whether, but maybe I'll just ask it a little bit more expansively. Like, people have talked a lot about whether there should be a domestic terror law change to more adequately confront white nationalist, white domestic extremist threats. And so I guess my question is, do you think that there needs to be an additional classification or additional legal changes? Do you think that the FBI has the tools it needs and that lawmakers have already, sorry, I'm excited. Or do you think do we have the laws on the books that we already need? Is this a matter of devoting the resources, both at the surveillance level, at the legal sort of intensity level? Is it just about using what we have, or do you think that there need to be additional tools to confront the threat of violent white power movements in the United States?
So that question is sufficiently close to Christopher Argyris's question that I'm going to bring Christopher Argyris to add to it his components, and then we can address them in one go.
Sure. Hi, Director Comey. It's really an honor to ask you a question and have you as an audience. So the second part of that question, which was the same as Kathleen's, Dr. Ballou's, was what can we do to normalize the idea that white people can be terrorists too, and that it's that when a white person does something versus a Muslim Arab person or a black person does something, we automatically call them a terrorist, or we call the white person doing an attack something other than a terrorist.
Yep. Should I go ahead and answer, Ben?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So that the second question telegraphs the answer I was going to give to a professor from my beloved University of Chicago Law School. I think I heard two messages from the agents who did this work when I was director. First, they said, at the ground level, we have the tools we need to lock these people up and to investigate them, because we have tools involving violence, involving weapons, explosives, these sorts of things. But labels matter. And it's important for us to be able to speak about it in a way that's logically consistent with the way we speak about international terrorism. It's important to send a signal, especially to local law enforcement, that these are not gun cases or threat cases. These are terrorism cases, to motivate our task force members who are critical to the response. And third, to be able to send a message to victims that we that we get this and we don't treat it as an also ran, and maybe fourth, to our own institution to motivate it. So there's all kinds of reasons why the FBI Agents Association said, yeah, we have the basic tools, but we need a domestic terrorism analog to the international terrorism statutory regime. So that logic made sense to me. It still does.
It's always seemed to me that there's two issues conflated in the domestic terrorism question. One is, do we need more authority, either on the investigative side or on the prosecutorial side? And I just think the answer to that is clearly not, right? I mean, if you shoot somebody, if you plan to shoot somebody, if you blow something up, if you plan to blow something up, there's a lot of law, right, that's providing adequate predicate for the investigation. The second issue, and that's providing ample incarceration time or, the death penalty in a bunch of cases. The other question is, are we somehow denigrating domestic, non-internationally inflected terrorism because the statutes are not called terrorism? They're called, killing a federal officer or, a hate crime and it just seems to me the solution to that problem is to gather a whole bunch of those statutes under a heading entitled domestic terrorism. You don't need to change a word of them. You just, if you kill a federal officer or shoot up a black church or do violence to a synagogue, that's in a heading called terrorism. I'm not sure you need a lot more than that. Am I missing something?
No, in the main, no, but it might be helpful both in terms of the signal it sends and in terms of making it easier to bring cases if you had one that made it a separate crime to use or threaten to use acts of violence to coerce a civilian population or government to track the international terrorism definitions.
Right, the Mary McCord proposal.
Yeah, but in the main, you don't need a lot. But look, I don't want to give any short shrift to the symbolic nature of it. It's that calling something a hate crime is really important to communities that suffer abuse and are the focus of acts of violence. Is really important, obviously, to honor the murder of Matthew Shepard, that we speak about crimes in a certain way. And so I think there's value in the heading, and I think underneath it there may be value in a specific analog to international terrorism.
Tom McGuckin, the floor is yours. I'm going to advise you just in advance to word your question in a way that has a chance of the former FBI director being able to answer it.
Okay, not being an attorney, I'm a little puzzled by that. And I will call him director instead of Jim, even though I approve his dress code. Okay, now, so let me try to word this according to what Ben's saying.
Let me give you another hint on that. If you ask a former senior official, is there enough evidence to indict somebody? He's gonna say, I couldn't possibly address that question without a full investigation and without being.
Okay, I get it. Okay, all right, director, or can I call you Jim? Jim, listen, I've been hung up on the word intent. And I'm not an attorney, but it just seemed that Mueller got hung up on intent and knowledge. And what I'm getting at here is in the Georgia tapes, okay, where he does say, I would like some more votes. Let's just leave any other statement. Is there sufficient, to your view, sufficient knowledge about what he was asking for and intent to ask for it, that he actually had an intent? He knew what he was doing. Is that meet with your standard, Ben?
Yeah, I get the question.
Well done.
Yeah, and the
That's
answer.
good. I can rephrase for Tom as just as a lawyer. I would say he just is kind of. Is there anything that's kind of on the record as evidence, obviously, that will obviously be construed as intent? Because
Lordy, there are tapes.
or the existence of the tapes. But no, but like even the existence of contact, like the mere contact, like actually has some type of mens rea value.
Yeah, the answer is maybe. Ben predicted what I would say. The reason is I don't know is that what's inside someone's head depends upon. First of all, I think it's appropriate that the government has to prove that someone is aware of the generally unlawful nature of their conduct when they're engaged in it. But you would look at things like, who are they speaking to? What's the tone in which they deliver those remarks? Who else is on the call? What else have they said around those things? To put together a package, as a prosecutor, you would then evaluate to say, will I be able to convince a jury of 12 beyond a reasonable doubt, unanimously, that this person acted with criminal intent? It's really hard. I mean, one of Donald Trump's great tricks is he tends to commit his potential crimes in broad daylight. And so it reminds me of people who used to say, defense lawyers, my client can't be guilty because what would he be doing standing in a bank lobby with a gun in broad daylight, right? No one would be that stupid. Donald Trump has a tendency to commit his offenses in broad daylight. And so that tends to cut the other way, but it doesn't mean you can't make the case.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I would just say, in more direct answer to the question, which I am happy to speculate about, I think Trump's got a world of hurt in Georgia. It's a long tape, and it's all inculpatory. Now, could there be other reasons why you would back off it as a prosecutor? Yeah, there are legit reasons why you might. But boy, that's a bad tape. And I think it's
Can I ask a weird question? From like Linda Tripp to this, like who are these people that constantly tape their freaking calls? Don't tape?
I'm going to defend Brad Raffensperger on this. Lindsey Graham has called you up in the past to lean on you about changing votes in this. And now and the president has tweeted about it repeatedly and attacked you. And now you're getting a call from the president. You want there to be a record. I don't know whether Georgia is a one-party consent or two-party consent state. But
it's not just the consent it's also just like the technical capability of recording a call is difficult. There's like a lot of like
speakerphone and turn on voice memos on your iPhone. Richard Wattenbarger. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Director Comey. I've actually been something of a fan since years ago. I interviewed for a contract at Bridgewater and saw the video that they had put up, and I thought, wow, this guy, he actually believes in integrity in business, and I thought, this is great. My question is, do you think that there needs to be more to be done to shield the leadership of the FBI and even perhaps the Justice Department from the whims of the chief executive? And if so, what sort of measures, which I imagine would have to be taken by the legislature, should be put in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for that. I don't think so. I worry about the idea of insulating the FBI director position further from the political leadership of the executive branch. The position is already extraordinarily powerful and separate by norm and culture. And I worry about giving that position even more independence than it has now. If there's a lesson of the last 4 years that the norms are real, and in some ways we reinforce them by our reaction to their violation. And so maybe someone's thought of something that I haven't heard about, but I don't like the idea of the Attorney General not being a political appointee or the Deputy Attorney General. I don't like the FBI Director not being a political appointee who reports up through the leadership of the Department of Justice. I just think there's too much danger. It's hard enough to supervise the FBI Director because he, or God willing, she someday, is there for a long period of time, has two bosses, because people don't realize that I also reported to the Director of National Intelligence, and is overseeing an institution that's just hard to learn about and watch even when you're doing it full time. very difficult for the leadership of the Department of Justice. And if you separate it even farther, I worry about unintended consequences of that.
All right, Anya, you don't have a camera on, but we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I probably didn't do my Zoom thing right.
No worries.
So my question, Director Comey, is from your books, it's really clear that integrity, ethics, and morality are important to you. And I would certainly argue that it's important aspects of great leadership. And, you know, perhaps it's very naive, but I used to think that leadership and national elected office were synonymous. But I've sort of come to the realization that they're maybe two totally different things. Leadership is one thing and politics is another. And politics is really nowadays just team red versus team blue. And integrity, trust, and honesty has absolutely nothing to do with it. So my question is, was I or am I just too naive and politics has always been like this? Or is there a way back? And if there is, what might that look like?
Yeah, I think you shouldn't be too depressed. First of all, because it's always been shades of gray. It's always less or more bad. I don't think we've ever attracted uniformly to high elective office people of absolute integrity. Politics in a complicated democracy like ours involves losing a piece of your soul just to get the office. It's the reason a lot of us are not comfortable running for office. But thank goodness good people do, right? Abraham Lincoln, our national saint, got elected in 1860, I think because a large portion of his voters thought he was going to abolish slavery and another large portion thought he was just going to restrict its expansion. He knew that and he got elected. And so thank goodness he did. So it's a business that attracts people who are willing to lose a piece of their soul. And at different times in history, you have an ebb and flow where more of the people who love losing their soul and never had one to begin with are in command, and other times when you have better people in command. One thing we don't do in the government is actually talk about leadership. Have you ever heard a confirmation hearing question about leadership? Because the Attorney General's job is a leadership job. It's not a lawyer job, not a policy advisor job. It's
and
a
it's
leadership
not even
job.
really
God,
a
it's such a good
management
point.
job.
It's not even a management job.
No, we don't talk about it. So what have you led and why would you be a good leader? And what are the attributes of a good leader? We just don't talk about those things at all. And so I wouldn't get too depressed, but your baseline ought to be, we've got a lot of gray in high elected office. Some are awesome, right? I didn't expect to be an admirer of Barack Obama, but I saw in him somebody who recognized that he was trading little pieces of his integrity to be successful, to try and accomplish greater goods, and talked about that. Wow. I think we see that with someone like Mitt Romney, who talks about it. They are an exception, at least at this point in American life.
Can I ask, hold on, before we get to Zuni really quick, can I ask what it was that what made you not, was it that he was kind of new and a junior senator, or was there something that made you not kind of expect to trust Barack Obama right off the bat? It wasn't, I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I didn't like some of the things he was saying coming into office about things that I knew about and I thought he had reason to know better about. For example, the ordering of investigations into interrogations, when that work had already been done by quality people like Chuck Rosenberg, who had found no basis for prosecutions, and that the president wanted and that Eric Holder agreed to reopen cases, struck me as just kabuki theater. And I thought, what are they starting off doing that kind of thing for? But I actually talked to Bob Mueller about him when I was first approached about the job. He said, this is a quality person. On the things that you will interact with him on, you will be very, very impressed. And I was.
Zunyi, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. And I'm going to refer to you as Director Comey because until Merrick Garland is confirmed, I just feel like that was the last time I can relate to the Department of Justice. So it's just kind of been in a holding pattern. So until then, after that, you can be former director, but for now. But I just wanted to ask a kind of a two-part question. Just first of all, how are you? Genuinely, how are you? And also, did you notice that writing the second book, any difference in, your focus or just kind of your output different from the first book because of all the kind of compound stress all of us are contending with, and just the things that you personally, on top of it, pre-pandemic, had to contend with.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm well. I'm a happy person, and that's really because I have a resilient family around me. I'm a grandfather now. I see my grandson almost every day. He's in my bubble, and so I'm very, very lucky in lots of ways. I feel a lot of the pain and anxiety that I know you all are feeling. My poor dad died last year, likely of COVID, although we'll never know for sure. And we still haven't had a funeral, and looks like we have to push it off again. And so I feel some of what we all feel, but in the main, I'm a very happy, lucky person. So thank you for asking. And I'm into yoga now, so you can't tell, but I'm really flexible. Just sitting here, I could slink out of this chair. But writing this book, I found it easier to write this book than the first one. And I kind of like this book more than the first one, because I got a chance to tell stories that are really cool stories that I had never told before. I had the materials for them. They're all based on court records and court transcripts. And I had a lot of fun going back through the stories, figuring out which ones to tell, to try and illustrate the lessons I hope people would bring from them. And I knew how to write a book, which I didn't the first time.
Yeah, the first book is really hard.
Don't tell me this. I just literally was talking to a book agent before I came on.
You got to do the first one, but the second book is easier than the first book.
Yeah, it was. It was.
But Jim, I wanted to ask you a question. Like, did you take notes? Like, I know, and I don't mean to sound like nosy. I'm just like actually wondering, like, when you're like in this kind of historic position, you recognize you're in a historic position. Like, it doesn't matter how good or bad you do it. You're still, like, Donald Trump was still, like, the president of the United States. And so, like, do you take notes, like, you go through certain things, or no? Because they could be subpoenaed or they could be whatever.
I was not a big note taker. I did, as you may have heard, create the odd memo after interactions with Donald Trump, but I had never done that before. But the book tells stories from cases where I still have my old trial notebooks. I still have transcripts. I still have briefs. And so I was able to quote directly from them because I wanted to get it precisely right. And then I tell stories about my friend Pat Fitzgerald, for example. I had him read them to make sure I was getting it right. And so, but in the main, from my dealings with presidents, I don't have any notes except for memos about Donald Trump. Because as you know, it was really important to remember what he says.
We have to get Pat Fitzgerald on the show. That'd be fun.
Yep.
Ducks with Pants, a.k.a. E.G. Phillips. The floor is yours.
All right. Hello, Director Comey. At the risk of asking you to talk out of term, how would you evaluate your successor's response and public muteness in response to the insurrection on 1/6?
And can I, before you answer that, can I divide that question into pre-120 and post-120? Because I think there's a good argument, good survival instinct argument for silence pre-120. The silence after the new administration takes office is much harder for me to understand.
Yeah, that's about right with me. First of all, my answer that I'm about to give you does not depend upon any communications with Chris Wray. I have not spoken to him or communicated with him since I was fired in May of 2017. I think I sent him one congratulatory email, and we exchange Christmas cards every year. So I don't have any insight into his thinking, but my bet is the same as Ben's, that he's been trying to make sure he doesn't get fired, to try and push to protect the institution as much as he can without allowing Donald Trump to decapitate it again, especially down the critical stretch. I actually understood why, I thought I understood why he wasn't out there right after the attack on the Capitol, because during that critical time, it would not be in the national interest for the FBI director to be fired and replaced by Richard Grenell or somebody, which again is a piece of our history we've had. After Watergate, Nixon put in a loyalist who burned Howard Hunt's documents on his home barbecue in Connecticut as acting director. So I get why he might have, and I bet it was painful for him to keep that profile, to absorb the slings and arrows. But since the 20th of January, I don't know whether we have long enough to judge, Ben. I would expect him to step out and represent his institution, to speak about its shortcomings, of which there are many, and its strengths, of which there are many, many, many more, and represent it in the way I talked about, I think the Attorney General and the U.S. attorneys need to do. Now, I know that's not his personality. He's not natural in a position like that, but he has to. But I would wait a little longer, Ben, before I would render judgment on that. I could imagine him wanting to get in sync with a confirmed Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, and a confirmed Attorney General to devise a strategy on that.
Fair enough, but I do think that there's been 200 arrests in the 1-6 stuff. The FBI is operational all over the place right now. It's the biggest terrorism investigation. I mean, it's got to be bigger than Boston Marathon. It's biggest since 9/11. And it's weird to have no daily briefing from the or regular briefing from the FBI director just about the investigation, even if he's not out there actively defending the institution or talking about the institution. There's he should be talking about the investigation. I don't know.
And I agree. And in normal times, I would expect that. But like I said, in this interim, I could imagine a thoughtful reason for waiting another. I don't know when the confirmation is going to be, but at least until you have a DAG in place.
Stephen Friedman, you get the third to last question today.
Thanks. You speak of reestablishing credibility and norms through truth and being on shows. One of the things that strikes me is that with the fusion of entertainment and politics, that becomes rather difficult. I'm wondering how you execute that, especially when basically lying is so well compensated on entertainment shows.
Yeah, I don't know exactly on the tactical level what shows you go on. I was joking, obviously, about The View, maybe even joking about Colbert. But you get out and show your
man.
Well, obviously, I didn't want to say that.
That's the
and you
gold
wear your
standard.
You wear your merch.
That's right. Merrick Garland should be on the show immediately after his confirmation.
It's probably in his strategy. But you get out there and find ways to show yourself, like I said, and not in the traditional boring ways that may not have been so boring in the 1970s and 80s, but find ways to show your nature, to radiate, in the words of Ed Levy, who taught me as a first-year law student, you radiate the values of the institution, and figuring out where you should be radiating is a tactical question that he has plenty of people who can help him answer.
Christopher, you get the second to last question today.
Thank you. Hello again, Director. In your book, you write that Bob Mueller, quote, chose to submit his unreadable and unread report and then go away without a sound. He could have found a way to speak to the American people in their language. So I would ask you, how do you square that review with reviews of your July and October statements and letters about the Hillary Clinton investigation in terms of speaking or not speaking?
Well, I guess there's a question about whether we're talking about the underlying decision to speak or how to speak. There's no doubt that Bob Mueller had options to communicate differently with the American people than he chose, consistent with his role as a special prosecutor, his ability to testify in front of Congress, those sorts of things. I chose to communicate in July at the close, or what I thought was the close of the Clinton investigation, in a way that I thought would maximize the ability of the American people to understand what we were doing and thereby trust that the Justice Department and the FBI had done it right, which is why I made a statement without interruption, without taking questions, and decided to do it in a video form so that it would be harder to cut up and harder to distort. I don't know whether that was right or not, but he had room. Even if you think I shouldn't have done that, he had plenty of room that the Inspector General would have been fine with to talk more about his work in a way that was digestible.
Yeah, I mean, Mueller has a million great skills, and one of them has never been public communications. I mean, you just can't. He's great in private settings but boy, you can't think of that sort of great Bob Mueller testimony where he really laid something out. It's just not It's like not who he is. All right.
He hated it.
I mean, it was clearly a mortification of the flesh. Kate, you get the last question today.
Oh, it's so funny that you have the Matrix poster.
I thought it was the vibe. Didn't you think it was the in lieu of vibe?
It is the vibe. It's so funny because I taught internet law today, and I did Oren Kerr, who is going to be on the show tomorrow, or Friday. I can't remember. No, Friday. Jen Taub is tomorrow. But Oren wrote this whole thing, and he stages the entire internet as being about the Matrix. And I'm just like, so I just had it top of mind, and then it was like in your background, and it was perfect. And so I'm just kind of curious where you got your Matrix poster from for people who might want to know.
I'm in the basement of my house, and we have a bunch of movie posters. Each of my many, many, many kids picked one that was their favorite, and they're hanging all around the basement. And so I took this one to stick in the back because I thought it was the vibe. I don't know where they actually got the poster itself.
Excellent.
They probably stole it from a movie theater back when people went to movie theaters.
Right. I had decided not to put the Comey rule up behind me.
There you go.
I think, had you done that, like Room Raider would have attacked you for it.
I was gonna say like spun out of control and self-destructed, but sure.
Yeah. We're gonna leave it there. Jim, it's a pleasure to see you, and see you. Like, you don't have your beard now.
He had a beard.
Yeah,
we had him on.
Jim had quite the COVID beard. We will do it again sometime soon. We will be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 58 minutes from now. Jim, you're a great American. Hold right there. I need a screenshot. Wait, don't. There it is. Got it.
Right.
Very good.
All right.
Lavender plant, the Matrix. It seems
we got
perfect.
We're going to see what Room Raider thinks. We will be back 22 hours, 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore, but we do have Lawfare merch. We will see you tomorrow. Thanks, Jim.
So great to meet you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.